Okay. You have another book out, right, Dr. Bud?
Yeah, this is actually sort of a modified, truncated version of the chapter on slavery from that book. So we just sent off for the proof 3 days ago. So it should be here by next weekend, and we'll look it over. And then if everything looks good, we'll hit the live button and be available. So
yeah, over the inter activities period during we have a 1 month period during the winter when there are various activities organized by student groups and courses and stuff. And the Christian organization crew normally has a lecture series, like an apologetics lecture series. So this year, one of the lectures was about slavery in the Bible, and yeah, I invited a few of those people from that.
Who gave it?
Brandon, I forget his last name. Brandon Cleaver.
I don't know if I know who that is.
Yeah, he's with the Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Well, the erstwhile Ravi Zacharias International Ministries.
Yeah, when I was a Christian, I used to read Ravi Zacharias stuff, and I used to always think, man, he's so brilliant. You have to read every paragraph like 3 different times before you can get it, And then I realized, oh, he's just bad at writing. That's all that is.
Speaking as a philosophy major, I feel your pain, but that doesn't always mean they're wrong. Like Heidegger is unbelievable, but there's actually a value in there.
Yeah.
Alex, let me know when you want to take it away. I'll start recording right before that.
Sounds good. Yeah, we can get started.
Okay, let me just start the recording. Okay, it started recording and it's streaming as well.
Excellent. Welcome everyone to our Course Zero event on Did the Bible Endorse Slavery? And I'm Alex Bookbinder, the current president of the Secular Society of MIT, and I welcome you all. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joshua Bowen, who will be our guest speaker today. Dr. Joshua Bowen graduated from Johns Hopkins University in 2017 with a Ph.D. in Assyriology, minoring in the Hebrew Bible. His dissertation was entitled A Preliminary Study of the Sumerian Curricular and Lamentational Texts from the Old Babylonian City of Kish, which was reworked and published in 2020 under the title Learning to Pray in a Dead Language, Education and Invocation in Ancient Sumerian. Joshua was a Fulbright Scholar in 2014 to 2015 and was awarded the D.A.A.D in the same year, which allowed him to spend the year in Tubingen, Germany, working with Dr. Konrad Volk on his dissertation project. As well as his PhD, Joshua holds a Master of Theology in Old Testament from Capital Bible Seminary, where he was awarded the Outstanding Thesis Award for his thesis entitled The Meaning of the Divine Name El Shaddai. And he also holds an MA in Near Eastern Studies from Johns Hopkins University, and also a Bachelor of Science in Religion from Liberty University. In addition to his book on Sumerian education and prayers, he has also published Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? And co-authored Learn to Read Sumerian, an introduction for the complete beginner, with his wife, Megan Lewis. He's currently completing Volume 1 of The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, which will be published later this summer. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joshua Bowen.
Well, thank you very much. That Appreciate that a lot. And it probably makes me sound more qualified maybe than I am, but let's hope I can do that justice here. So thank you very much to the Secular Society for having me. And Alex, I really appreciate the introduction. So tonight we're going to be talking about slavery in the Hebrew Bible, and we'll get into the New Testament as well. And, hopefully this will allow everyone to, place this topic in a slightly broader context and understand what it is that scholars actually do say, despite what you may hear from, say, Christian apologists. This is actually it's not as controversial perhaps as, what people might think. So, okay. Just get this. Okay. The presence of laws relating to slavery in the Bible are often quite jarring to believer and unbeliever alike. How could a text, either divinely inspired by God or standing at the heart of an all-pervasive religion, contain laws that endorse the appropriate practice of slavery? For some believers, these laws are part of an outdated system that has been superseded by the teachings of the New Testament. For others, these laws are studied in their ancient Near Eastern context in the hopes that this comparative data will show the Old Testament laws to be superior to those obtaining in the ancient Near East. Still others seek to demonstrate that the word slavery should not be applied to these laws in the Hebrew Bible, and this type of servitude cannot and should not be compared to slavery in the antebellum South. This, it would seem, casts the Old Testament slavery laws in a better light, making them appear less severe and atrocious than what we might imagine. What are we to make of all of this? What was slavery like as described in the Hebrew Bible? Were there in fact laws concerning the appropriate practice of debt and chattel slavery? How did these laws compare to those from other ancient Near Eastern nations? If there was genuine slavery in the laws of the Old Testament, did the New Testament do away with this practice? Before we look at the specific biblical passages, it is important to define our terms. While the definition of slavery can have nuanced meanings depending on the context in which the term is used, there are essential aspects that can be seen throughout. In what follows, we will essentially define slavery as a condition in which an individual, or rights to their labor, is owned by another, either temporarily or permanently. The owner controls and benefits from the actions and activities of the owned individual. My goal in this presentation will be to provide the reader with a broad overview of slavery in the Hebrew Bible. We will examine select portions of the three primary legal sections in the Old Testament that deal with the issue of slavery: Exodus 21, part of the so-called Covenant Code, Deuteronomy 15, and Leviticus 25, part of the Holiness Code. Following some limited commentary on these passages, we will briefly examine the common apologetic that attempts to explain God allowing slavery in the Old Testament because of man's sinfulness. Now, this presentation is a truncated form of my chapter on slavery in my forthcoming book, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 1, which should be available within the next few weeks. Let's begin with Exodus chapter 20. In verses 2 through 6, we read, "If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year he shall go free, without paying anything. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons and daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to the master, and only the man shall go free. But if the servant declares, 'I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free,' then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be a servant for life." So what is the law describing here? An Israelite buys a fellow Israelite, likely due to impoverishment, and the law sets the limit of debt service to 6 years. First, how are we to understand this language of buying? Many apologists are quick to point out that one of the ways in which the Hebrew word kana, to buy, is glossed is to acquire, softening the phrase from "if you buy" to if you acquire, can make the idea of procuring a slave a bit more palatable. The reality, however, is that the verb should certainly be translated to buy, as this is not only expected in the context, but is the typical way in which the verb is used in similar passages. There are many verses in the Hebrew Bible that refer to slaves being purchased. Abraham, for example, owned different types of slaves. In Genesis 17:12-13, for example, we read, "For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your household or bought with money from a foreigner, those who are not your offspring. Whether born in your household or bought with your money, they must be circumcised. My covenant in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant." Abraham carries out God's command in verse 27, and every male in Abraham's household, including those born in his household or bought from a foreigner, was circumcised with him. Hamilton comments on this passage, "Circumcision is to extend even beyond the family circle. It is to be done for the house-born slave or for the one bought with money from any foreigner." The verb kana is, in fact, used quite commonly to describe the process of purchasing goods and property. In Genesis 49:30, we see Abraham buying a field. Quote, "The cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought," Hebrew kana, "along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite." Similar transactions can be seen in Jeremiah 13:2, the purchasing of a belt, and 19:1, the purchasing of a clay jar. Kitchen observes, "Slaves could readily be bought from other owners and general merchants." In short, slaves were purchased regularly in the Old Testament, along with other goods and property, utilizing the Hebrew verb kana. This is the same word that appears in Exodus 21:2. So, we have an Israelite who is purchasing another Israelite as a slave. What are the rules that govern this debt slave service? The male debt slave is to serve for 6 years and be released free of debt in the 7th. Thus, both the principal and any interest or additional charges would be satisfied by the 6 years of service. This is the basic rule concerning the male Hebrew slave. However, there are other circumstances to be considered in this transaction. If he comes alone, he is to go free alone. But if he has a wife when he comes, she is to go with him. This seems fairly straightforward. If the debt slave is purchased as a single man, he is to be released as a single man. If he was enslaved as a married man, both he and his wife go free upon his release in the 7th year. So far, so good. However, the situation is complicated in verse 4. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons and daughters, the woman and her children shall belong to her master, and only the man shall go free. The text has set forth the general principle that a Hebrew slave can only be made to serve for 6 years in order to pay off his debt. Now we are dealing with the different scenarios that can occur within that general principle. If he is single when he comes in, he goes out single. Married, goes out married. In other words, as you came in, that's how you go out. This would also apply, therefore, to a Hebrew slave who is given a wife by his master during his term of service. Because she was the property of the master, the law required that she remain his property, along with any children that she would produce. Durham notes, if, however, his wife has married him during his servitude, obviously by the permission and through the provision of his owner, both the wife and any children born to such a union must remain with the owner when the temporary slave claims his freedom in the 7th year. They are obviously the owner's property. In other words, although the male debt slave has a set term of service, the female slave and her children are chattel slaves and remain the property of their owner. This stipulation in the law explains what follows in Exodus 21:5-6. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. The male debt slave is left with two options. First, He can exercise his right to release in the 7th year and go on his way. However, he would do so alone. His second option would be to remain with his wife and children, continuing to serve as a slave in the master's home. Because his wife and children are the property of the master, not subject to release after the set term of service, remaining with his family is contingent upon him dedicating himself to lifetime service to the master. Jackson summarizes, after stating the basic rule of liberation ex lege after 6 years' service, Exodus 21:2, verses 3 through 6 deal with the effects upon the slave's family, taking account of 2 variables. The source of that family, pre-enslavement or post-enslavement, the wife provided in the latter case by the master, and if post-enslavement, whether the slave is prepared to abandon his new family. If the male debt slave decides to remain with his master, wife, and children, he swears an oath of a lifelong servitude and is marked as a chattel slave. Having dealt with the rules for the male debt slave, the text turns to the female slave. If a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do. If she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has broken faith with her. If he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. If he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first one of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these 3 things, she is to go free without any payment of money. Exodus 21:7 through 11. The first set of laws concerned an indebted Hebrew man being sold as a debt slave to pay off his debt. Here, the passage speaks of a man selling his daughter as a slave in order to satisfy a debt. In this case, she is entering into a sexual relationship with either her master or his son, and given this relationship and its social and financial consequences to her value, she is to receive certain rights from her master. Her status must be changed, either to a wife or a concubine, and her sexual and reproductive capacities are now in use. This also means that unlike the male debt slave, who is also used in a reproductive capacity but without the social and financial consequences, she is not to be released after 6 years. Jackson writes, it indicates that a male debt slave may be used for sexual services, effectively to breed permanent slaves for his master, without interference with his status. Sexual services are no different from other services in this respect. Verses 7 through 11 gives us the opposite side of the coin. A woman debt slave cannot be used for sexual services unless her status is thereby changed. Sexual activity alters the status of the woman debt slave and not that of the male. This affords her protection, as odd as that may sound, as her master must provide for her. Even if she falls out of favor with him, he cannot reduce her to the status of a simple slave and sell her to foreigners. He must continue to provide for her or allow her to be redeemed. Concerning this, Prop writes, a Hebrew maidservant is not released after 6 years, even if she is married to a Hebrew slave. While at first glance this non-liberation of the maidservant may seem oppressive, the statute is designed to protect her. Instead of liberating a menial to shift for herself, the law encourages the owner to elevate her to the status of wife or at least concubine, end quote. Before we leave this section of Exodus, we should briefly consider the question of the daughter's consent in this situation. Does she agree to be sold as a female slave? I make a more detailed argument elsewhere, but the text clearly is not concerned with her opinion on the matter. Prop agrees. Quote, in 21:7, the subject is the girl's father, not her purchaser. In contrast, the paraphrase in Deuteronomy 15:12, when your Hebrew brother or sister sells him or herself, empathizes more with the slave and in fact contains more liberal provisions. Exodus stresses rather the woman's passivity, subject to the authority first of her father and then of her purchaser, end quote. Now, perhaps no other passage is more frequently discussed in slavery debates than Exodus 21, 20-21. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. It is unsurprising that these two verses carry so much significance in the discussion. The text describes a scenario in which either a male or female slave is beaten with a wooden rod, which sounds justifiably horrific to us. One might expect that this was the purpose of the law. Don't beat your male or female slave with a wooden rod. Of course, we know that this was not the law's intent. The question is, how should we understand the purpose of this regulation? While it might seem as though the law is giving a slaveholder a type of manual on how to legally beat their slave within an inch of their lives, I don't think that this interpretation correctly understands the passage in its context. It is absolutely true that masters beat their slaves, and this passage indicates that if a master beats their slave and they survive a day or two, then there's no punishment that will come to the master, as the slave is their property. However, this law is actually intended to provide the slave with some level of protection from physical abuse and murder. We see in the Proverbs that, quote, servants cannot be corrected by mere words. Though they understand, they will not respond. Do you see someone who speaks in haste? There is more hope for a fool than for him. A servant pampered from youth will turn out to be insolent. Proverbs 29, 19-21. Don Demayev writes, a number of proverbs and aphorisms have been preserved which show a contemptuous attitude towards slaves. A slave ruling over princes is out of place, Proverbs 19:10. Mere words will not discipline a slave, since he does not respond even if he understands, Proverbs 29:19. A slave pampered from boyhood will become ungrateful in the end, 29:21. What we see, therefore, in Exodus 20-21 is a law regulating the beating of one's slave. The rationale of the law is likely focused on the intent of the master in the situation. If the master beat the slave so severely that the slave died immediately, verse 20, then there would be severe punishment, likely death. However, if the slave did not die immediately, but survived a day or two, then, according to this logic, the intent of the master was likely not murderous. In other words, if the slave did not die immediately, then the benefit of the doubt would be given to the master, and the death would be seen as accidental. Fox concludes, none of the biblical law codes place restrictions on beating one's slaves, male or female. If, however, the owner kills a slave, vengeance of an unspecified sort is exacted. If the slave survives the beating, no compensation is required, for the slave is his master's money. In verses 26 and 27, we read, an owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. While it is clear that these laws are in place to benefit and protect the slave, they are often misunderstood in their context. In the preceding verses, the text is elaborating on the principle of talion, generally designated lex talionis or the law of retaliation. In verses 23-25, we see, but if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. In this context, we would expect that if a slave were on equal footing with the master before the law, we would read something akin to, an owner who hits his male or female slave in the eye and destroys it will have his own eye destroyed. This, of course, is not the case. The principle of retaliation, that the slave would have the right to the eye of the master, is not in play here. Prop writes, in 21, 26-27, having just enunciated the principle of talion, he raises the question, are slaves entitled to talionic retribution? The answer is no. Instead, they are generously compensated for their injuries. As in Babylon, talion applies only between social equals. Houtman concurs. Talio, 21:23-25, only applies to the free citizen, not to a slave. Thus, the slave is protected by the law, at least in theory, from abuse or excessive beatings. If they are killed as a direct result of a beating, it is considered murder, and the master is likely to be killed. If the master destroys or puts out an eye or tooth, the slave is forgiven their debt and set free. If any of your people, Hebrew men or women, sell themselves to you and serve you 6 years, in the 7th year you must let them go free. And when you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I give you this command today. But if your servant says to you, I do not want to leave you, because he loves you and your family and is well off with you, then take in all and push it through his earlobe into the door, and he will become your servant for life. Do the same for your female servant. Do not consider it a hardship to set your servant free, because their service to you these 6 years has been worth twice as much as that of a hired hand. And the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. Deuteronomy 15:12-18. As you can see, there are many similarities between what we saw in Exodus 21 and what appears here in Deuteronomy 15. The text speaks of Hebrew slaves who serve for 6 years and are released in the 7th. The slave is also able to voluntarily serve for life, and a similar ritual is performed on that occasion. There are, however, differences between these passages. Notice that the laws here in Deuteronomy pertain not only to the Hebrew man, but also to the Hebrew woman. In this passage, the woman is also to be released or is allowed to remain a slave for life. More significantly, however, is the command for the master to provide a substantial amount of goods to the newly freed slave. The overall tone of the passage is one of encouraging the master not to hold back from his slave. As God has supernaturally blessed and provided for his people, he will continue to do so if they keep his covenant. In like manner, the master should also give generously to the slave. This concept of supernatural provision for obedience is seen prominently in Deuteronomy 28 and will be a central theme in the next chapter that we will analyze, Leviticus 25. Leviticus 25 is likely familiar to most atheists and apologists who debate the issue of slavery, though probably to a very limited degree. Specifically, verses 44-46 are often cited to show the harsh reality of slavery in the Old Testament. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Obviously, these verses are incredibly significant to the slavery discussion. However, before we investigate what they mean, it is important to establish the context in which they exist. Thus, let's begin with Leviticus 25 as a whole. The beginning of the chapter contains God's command to let the land of Israel have a year-long rest from farming every 7th year. The next section, verses 8-17, commands the people to also hold a year of rest every 50th year. They were to have 7 Sabbath years, totaling 49 years, followed by a Jubilee in the 50th year. During this year of the Jubilee, people were to be returned to their land and debts were to be canceled. This applied only to the Israelites. Following verses 18 to 22, which describe God's supernatural provision if they would obey his commands, we come to the critical section of the chapter for our purposes, laws concerning Israelites that become poor, verses 25 to 55. There are three scenarios that are discussed in these verses with respect to an Israelite. In the first, we see if one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, verse 25. Israelites owned property in the land of Israel, and if they fell into poverty, selling a portion of their land was a viable option. The law required, however, that the land would eventually return to its original owner, either by a near relative redeeming it for them or during the year of Jubilee. In the second scenario, verses 35 to 38, we see if any of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and stranger, so they can continue to live among you. Do not take interest or any profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money at interest or sell them food at a profit. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. It appears that in this case, the Israelite has already sold his property and still cannot make ends meet. Should this occur, the poor Israelite was to be cared for by their fellow Israelites, who were to loan them what they needed at no interest. They were to fear and obey God by supporting their poor brother, with the result that God would provide for them because of their obedience. In the third scenario, the Israelite actually reaches the stage where he must sell himself into debt slavery. The response of his fellow Israelites, however, is to differ substantially with what we see in both Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15. If any of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children are to be released, and they will go back to their own clans and to their property of their ancestors. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. It is easy to see the distinguishing feature of the treatment of Israelites in this section. They are not to be treated as slaves. In contrast to Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15, where it was perfectly legitimate to keep an Israelite as a slave, this is no longer allowed in Leviticus 25. So, if the Israelites can no longer purchase fellow Israelites as slaves, a natural question arises in this context. Where should they get slaves? We get our answer from the verses that follow. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Amongst other things, we learn from these verses that 1. Chattel slaves can be purchased from the foreigners living in the nations around Israel and from foreign tenant farmers living in Israel. 2. These slaves become their property. 3. That property can be passed on as inheritance to their children. And 4. They can be made to serve as slaves for life. Don DeMaiev sums this up well. The next source of slavery was obtaining slaves through purchase from neighboring nations. This source was in every possible way encouraged by biblical instructions. Such slaves were legally considered the absolute property of their owners, and their status was permanent. In short, the Israelites were given special treatment as God's slaves. Because they already had a master, God himself, they could not be treated as slaves by another master. Instead, they were to be treated as hired workers, whether under the control of an Israelite or foreign master. In contrast to this, foreign slaves were able to be purchased, kept as property, passed on as inheritance, and made to serve for life. While theological interpretations are not the focus of my investigation into the Hebrew Bible and are outside of my field of expertise, I have found that addressing certain arguments made by apologists can open up the dialogue in a meaningful way. In light of this, I would like to address an interpretation that, while certainly not new, has resurfaced with some frequency. This apologetic argument admits that the Old Testament endorsed slavery, but argues that this was God's way of slowly developing the morality of humanity, beginning with his chosen people. In other words, God allowed slavery in the Hebrew Bible, but was all the while slowly working to reveal to humanity that it was immoral. There are a few pieces of evidence that are cited in this regard. First, and certainly foremost, is Matthew 19, 3-9, where Jesus is tested on the subject of divorce. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh'? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery." We need not go into great detail in this passage, as the basic principle that is used to support the argument is relatively clear. Jesus is confronted with a portion of the Mosaic Law from Deuteronomy 24, which seems to contradict what Jesus had just taught. Jesus responded that Moses had legally permitted men to divorce their wives because their hearts were hard. This was not God's intent, however, from the beginning. In other words, in the beginning, God created man and woman to be united for all time. He later allowed for divorce because of the sinfulness of mankind. Now, this passage is then abstracted and applied to slavery, another situation, it is argued, that Jesus and the New Testament was attempting to bring humanity out of. While slavery is not mentioned in the text, the principle of returning to creation can similarly be applied. Immediately following creation, before the fall, people were not enslaved to one another, but rather lived with one another with equality. It was only later, when mankind became sinful and wicked, that God had to regulate their behavior in an attempt to bring them back to the pristine state of creation. In order to effectively demonstrate that Jesus intended to bring about the abolishment of slavery, or even to draw attention to its immoral character, it would seem likely that Jesus and other New Testament authors would have condemned the practice in some overt way. Is this what we see? In order to demonstrate that Jesus and the writers of the New Testament spoke out against or condemned slavery, there are several common passages that are cited by apologists. Setting aside general statements about loving one another, for example, Matthew 7:12, Paul's letter to Philemon often appears early in the conversation. Here, it is argued, the apostle implores Philemon to free his slave Onesimus upon his return. Although the meaning of the book is debated, assuming the interpretation most in favor of an anti-slavery position by the apostle, Onesimus would indeed have been a slave of Philemon, whom Paul was seeking to have freed. Loza writes that, according to this type of interpretation, quote, "The purpose of Philemon, it was assumed, was to illustrate in a novelistic fashion how the Christian communities in the post-Pauline period handled the question of slavery," end quote. Another text that is frequently cited comes from the so-called pastoral epistles. In 1 Timothy 1:9-10, the writer is speaking on the purpose of the law, listing those for whom it was made. Quote, "We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, and for those practicing homosexuality, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. In verse 10, the inclusion of slave traders in a list of immoral practices is used to support the New Testament's anti-slavery position. The next verse that is cited in this regard is Galatians 3:28, where Paul writes, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for all are one in Christ Jesus." Betts summarizes the two ways in which this verse can be understood with respect to slavery. Quote, "Taken alone, the statement can be understood in two ways. A, as a declaration of the abolishment of the social institution of slavery, or B, as a declaration of the irrelevancy of that institution, which would include the possibility of its retainment." If the former position is taken, then one could argue that Jesus came to do away with the social institution of slavery. One final set of passages comes up less frequently, but should also be included in this discussion. The parable of the talents found in Matthew 25 and Luke 19. The parable speaks of three slaves who are entrusted with different amounts of money to invest for their master, who then left on a journey. The first two slaves invested wisely, earning substantial returns on their investments. However, the third did nothing with the money, but instead hid it away safely until the master's return. While it might seem odd to include this parable in a discussion on the New Testament's condemnation on slavery, it could be argued that providing slaves, quote unquote, with such substantial amounts of money, along with the freedom to invest it, belies a very different slave-master relationship, and that calling it slavery is simply inaccurate. Let's deal with each of these arguments in reverse order, beginning with the parable of the talents. While it might seem odd or out of place for a master to entrust sums of money to his slaves, this was common practice during this period. Lutz writes, Jesus' hearers would hardly have been thinking of the practice, common in the Middle East, of doing business with borrowed capital, since that was possible only for free persons. Here, we are dealing explicitly with slaves. Instead, the parable assumes that, among other things, clever slaves were to do. The parable assumes, that among other things, clever slaves were to do business with their master's money with the clear understanding that both the money and the profit earned belonged to the slave owner. Roman law designated that the money given to slaves for this purpose was as peculium, end quote. Sorry about that. Concerning slavery in the ancient Near East, Westbrook writes, quote, "A slave could act as an agent for his master. In this capacity, he could make contracts with free persons and litigate. He could also manage property on his own behalf in the form of a peculium given him by his master," end quote. In other words, two things are clear in the passage. First, these were slaves. And second, the money that was given them was not their own. All of the money and any interest or profit it brought belonged to the master. Turning to Galatians 3:28, we remember that there are two ways of interpreting the phrase, neither slave nor free. One, abolishing the institution of slavery, or two, showing it to be irrelevant. Betts notes, the overwhelming evidence in early and later Christianity seems to recommend only the second option viable, a view taken by most commentators. That passage is not intended to do away with the social institution of slavery, and this is clear for several reasons. First, the other two statements in the verse, neither Jew nor Gentile, and especially neither male nor female, can hardly be understood as doing away with such distinctions. Whatever one would argue concerning the attitude of the New Testament writers on the role and status of women, another topic entirely, it would be difficult to maintain that passages like 1 Corinthians 14, 34 to 35 would allow the social distinction between men and women to be ignored. The point of Galatians 3:28, it would seem, is to express the unity that members of the body of Christ share by being in Christ. McKnight writes, "To be in Christ is to be in spiritual fellowship with him through God's Spirit. This is one of the ways of defining what a Christian is, one who is in Christ." End quote. Although believers are now all united and equal in the eyes of God, having been baptized into Christ, this does not negate the reality of social and role distinctions between members of the referenced social groups, including slaves. Avalos concludes, Galatians 3:28 was clearly meant solely to establish the reckoning of believers as Abraham's seed, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, or slave status. Other New Testament authors certainly did not see this passage as incompatible with having Christian slaves or ordering Christian slaves to serve their slave masters. When we consider 1 Timothy 1:10, where slave traders are included in the list of vices, it may seem straightforward that this shows that the writer condemned slavery. This, however, is simply not the case. The Greek word anthropotistes is glossed as slave trader and kidnapper in a standard Greek lexicon, but only appears one time in the New Testament, here in our passage. Harold describes slave traders in this way. Slave traders displayed vice at every stage of the slave trading operation, from the illegitimate acquisition and the deceptive selling of merchandise to the polluting result such sale had on places and people. In acquiring merchandise when legitimate sources such as war captives did not offer enough supply, they were not above kidnapping free citizens, a criminal act against the law of nations. In fact, this word for slave trader appears in other so-called vice lists outside of the New Testament, clearly demonstrating that the act of stealing or illegally procuring another individual was not only considered immoral in the New and Old Testaments, but also among the other nations. Avalos notes, the fact that slave societies of Greece and Rome condemned an anthropotistes indicates that pure slave trading cannot be meant. Harold concludes, rather than revealing some alleged early Christian condemnation of slavery or the slave trade, the language of 1 Timothy articulates attitudes commonplace among masters in the Roman Empire. The term anthropotestai was derogatory only in the sense of the slave traders' exploitation, economic and sexual, of free citizens, and of their proverbial abuse of the law. The ancient world believed in the moral goodness of slavery, yet condemned the immorality of slave traders. End quote. Finally, let's examine the book of Philemon. As we discussed above, apologists often turn to Philemon as a perhaps subtle statement on the position of Christianity on slavery. However one understands the situation being described in the book, we would be hard-pressed to see it as presenting an overarching declaration on the institution of slavery. Loza writes concerning this view, for good reasons, this view has found no acceptance, and today is no longer held by anyone. The letter to Philemon is neither the disguise of a general idea nor the promulgation of a generally valid rule about the question of slavery, end quote. Assuming that a slave-master relationship existed between Philemon and Onesimus, it seems clear that Paul leaves the decision to free Onesimus to Philemon. In verses 8 to 9, for example, Paul writes, therefore, although in Christ I could be bold and order you to do what you ought to do, yet I prefer to appeal to you on the basis of love. Loza comments, it is the intercession of the apostle in a concrete situation in which love, agape, must be promoted by decision and deed. This lack of direct command, based on the immoral character of the act of enslavement, is indeed problematic in the context. In other words, if we were to see a passage like 1 Timothy 1:10 as a direct indictment against the practice of slavery, it is incredibly difficult to imagine a scenario in which Paul would say, I'm leaving this up to you. I don't want to force you to set him free. Avalos says it this way. Nowhere in the letter do we see Paul saying, slavery is a sin and you must free Onesimus. Nowhere in the letter do we have anything even akin to the strong directive issued by Paul on such things as drunkenness and adultery, 1 Corinthians 6, 8-9, incest, 1 Corinthians 5, or just not working hard enough, 2 Thessalonians 2:10, end quote. At best, it would seem, the book of Philemon is evidence of Paul encouraging Philemon to forgive and free his runaway slave in order that Onesimus might return to Paul to help him in the ministry. In no way is this a broad directive against owning other human beings as slaves. Now that we've addressed the passages that are cited in support of this argument, let's turn to a few others that seem to show that slavery was not only accepted as a social norm, but was assumed to be the norm for Jesus and his followers. I will begin with Luke 17, 7-10, and Jesus' statement about unprofitable servants. Suppose one of you has a servant plowing or looking after the sheep. Would he say to the servant when he comes in from the field, come along now and sit down to eat? Won't he rather say, prepare my supper, get yourself ready, and wait for me while I eat and drink? After that, you may eat and drink. Will he thank the servant because he did what he was told to do? So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. While Jesus' story is concerned with the actions and attitudes of his disciples, it also provides us with insight into current attitudes towards slavery. Green writes, Jesus is not so much inviting an allegorical reading of master-servant roles as drawing on a well-known reality of village life to teach something about faithfulness. Envisioned, is a small landholder farmer whose one slave performs the various outdoor and household duties that would be divided between slaves in a larger estate. The household master-slave analogy has become a regular fixture of the Lucan narrative, providing a basis for important instruction on kinship, faithfulness, and status seeking, end quote. The message is that just as a slave who performs his required duties is due no special thanks or treatment, and thus earns nothing by it, so also followers of Jesus who perform their required duties are due no special reward thereby. Fitzmyer writes, in the present Lucan setting, Jesus' words stress that the Christian disciple who is a servant or slave and has well carried out his task can only regard himself as an unprofitable servant, end quote. What is assumed by this story, therefore, is 1, the reality of slavery during Jesus' time, 2, the appropriateness of drawing the analogy based on the details of that reality, and 3, the complete lack of condemnation for the practice as described in the analogy. Throughout the book of Luke, in fact, the parables and stories of Jesus show a reliance on the normalcy and acceptance of the practice of slavery. Charles calls attention to the stories of the slaves in Luke 12, who remain alert while awaiting their master's return in verses 35 through 46, contrasted with those who received beatings for improper behavior, along with depictions seen in chapters 14 through 16. Far from condemning the practice of slavery, Charles explains that Jesus, as he does throughout the Gospels, relied on a normative portrayal of the slave in antiquity to illustrate his teachings. This pattern can also be seen in the Deutero-Pauline epistles. Deutero-Pauline writings. As Glancy notes, letters attributed to Paul whose authorship is disputed address Christian slaveholders, urging them to treat their slaves fairly. In 1 Timothy 6:2, an exhortation to slaves to show deference to their believing masters indicates the presence within the local Christian community of both slaves and slaveholders. The New Testament epistles consider slaveholding compatible with membership in the Christian body, end quote. In the end, one would be hard-pressed to argue that the New Testament, Jesus included, clearly and overtly condemns the practice of owning another human being as property. In fact, we see time and again that Jesus utilizes the well-known practice of slavery to teach principles of appropriate behavior and loyalty within the context of discipleship. Passages that are cited to support open or implied condemnation of the practice, including Galatians 3:28, 1 Timothy 1:10, the book of Philemon, or even the parables of the talents, are in fact not setting forth such condemnation. So, we have looked at slavery and the laws of the Hebrew Bible, as well as a common apologetic that is built on a faulty understanding of the New Testament. In this final section, I would like to briefly address another common argument that appears in this discussion on Old Testament slavery. How many times have you heard someone say, now, we know that slavery in the Old Testament was nothing like the slavery that we saw in the antebellum South? I used to ignore such statements, as they ultimately have little bearing on the question of did the Old Testament endorse slavery. However, I began to wonder if such a strong contrast should be made between these two forms of slavery. One of the key tensions that appears to connect the slave laws in the Old Testament to those in the South was the right of the master to beat their slave in order to ensure proper behavior balanced against keeping the master from abusing the slave. As we saw in Exodus 21:20-21, the passage is intended to mitigate abuse, but to do so in such a way that it allows for the expected and encouraged practice of corporal punishment on the slave. Colonial laws wrestled with this tension. Concerning the Virginia law in 1669, Morris writes, "The lawmakers began with an obvious problem. Slaves could not be punished by the extension of their time in servitude, so that their obstinacy could only be suppressed by violence." In other words, a slave was clearly a chattel in this scenario, and it was understood that the term of service was indefinite. Thus, threats of extending such a term of service were unavailable to the slave owner. Instead, it was reasoned, the only means to ensure good behavior and service from a slave was physical correction. In a 1723 law in Virginia, this reasoning resulted in the freedom of a master to beat their slave without retribution, as long as it was done for correction. Morris writes, "The law provided that there would be no punishment or prosecution if a slave died, quote, by reason of any stroke or blow given during his or her correction," unquote. In South Carolina in 1740, we see that Christianity provided some motivation to avoid abusing one's slave. Cruelty is not only highly unbecoming of those who profess themselves Christians, but is odious in the eyes of all men who have any sense of virtue or humanity, end quote. Surprisingly, at least to our modern senses, the penalty for murdering a slave under this South Carolina law was a fine of 700 pounds, and the guilty party was not allowed to hold public office. Of course, establishing that a death by beating rose to the level of murder was a difficult case to prove in such circumstances. The laws appear to have inadvertently allowed great loopholes for the slave owners to exploit. Morris summarizes, "These were the colonial statutory schemes. No free person could be executed for killing a slave in South Carolina, no matter how grotesque or unjustified the killing might have been. Virginia, on the other hand, left open the possibility, however remote, that anyone, even a slave owner, could be executed for the homicide of a slave," end quote. There was a significant development, relatively speaking, in the legal system after the Revolutionary War. Morris writes, "After the Revolution, a growing humanitarian sensibility led to changes in parts of the law of homicide when applied to slaves. State after state, whether through constitutions, judicial decisions, or statutes, extended greater legal security to slaves. For example, in Georgia's Constitution in 798, we read, quote, "Any person who shall maliciously dismember or deprive a slave of life shall suffer such punishment as would be inflicted in case the like offense had been committed on a free white person, and on the like proof, except in case of insurrection by such slave, and unless such death should happen by accident in giving such slave moderate correction," end quote. Thus, if it was determined that a slave master had abused their slave to the point of dismemberment or death, the penalty would be equal to the penalty for murdering a free white person. Nevertheless, let's not forget the end of the law. Unless such death should happen by accident in giving such slave moderate correction. The tension remained in the eyes of the lawmakers. Masters must be allowed to beat their slaves for the purposes of correction. However far the law was progressing in an attempt to protect slaves from abuse, it seemed to always run up against the problem of corporal punishment for correction. Let's look at one of the legal decisions that was made during the early 19th century in order to see what some of the judges considered when ruling on these matters. In North Carolina's 1801 case State versus Boone, Morris summarizes Judge Johnston's determination. Quote, "Johnston argued that the murder of a slave was the same as the murder of a white person under the right circumstances. It was, in fact, more despicable. It was a crime, quote, of the most atrocious and barbarous nature. It is an evidence of a most depraved and cruel disposition to murder one so much in your power that he is incapable of making resistance, even in his own defense," end quote. Not only was murdering a slave placed on par with murdering a white person, but it was considered even more vile, as it took advantage of one who was weak and powerless in the situation. In short, in the antebellum South, where slavery flourished, the laws were set in place in an apparent attempt to curb the abuse of slaves. Slaves were not to be at the absolute mercy of their masters, and should a master murder their slave, the punishment was the same as murdering a free white person. Whether these laws were in fact enforced is a separate matter. We know that they generally were not. The laws themselves strove for what they considered to be fair and humanitarian treatment of slaves, allowing only for moderate physical correction. As we have seen in the legal sections of the Old Testament, the laws that govern the treatment of slaves in Exodus 21 were in many ways similar. Although the Exodus 21 laws pertained most likely to dead slaves, and thus their release was set after 6 years of service, the rationale for the laws in Exodus 21, 20-21, and 26-27 are quite similar. Slaves were not to be at the mercy of their masters when it came to life and limb. Slave owners must be allowed to apply moderate physical correction to their slaves, but should take care when doing so, as abuse which leads to death or loss of limb results in punishment. Indeed, such sharp lines of distinction should not be drawn between Old Testament and antebellum laws, as we would do well to remember that a very similar legal rationale in both periods resulted in the atrocities that we saw prior to the Civil War. With slavery and its effects still fresh in our minds and present in our world, it is sometimes hard to imagine that a book that is considered divinely inspired would endorse such a practice. As we have seen, however, the legal sections of the Old Testament clearly do endorse the practice of both debt and chattel slavery, and the New Testament, at a minimum, assumes its common reality and in no way condemns it. My goal in this presentation has been to examine what the Bible says about slavery, primarily in the Old Testament. The topic of slavery is one that makes us uncomfortable, and yet it comes up time and again in discussions about morality and the God of the Bible. We would do well, whether as a believer or atheist, to understand what the Bible actually says about the practice of slavery, rather than building our conclusions and positions on faulty arguments or apologetics. Slavery was indeed endorsed in the Old Testament, and the New Testament did not condemn its practice. The Old Testament laws concerning slavery were not so different from those in the antebellum South, which should give us pause. We must remember the atrocities that transpired prior to the Civil War and vigilantly guard against repeating the past by understanding the nature of slavery, not only in the South, but in the laws of the Old Testament. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Bowen.
Of course.
That was a lovely talk.
Should I stop sharing or?
Sure. I mean, I don't know. Maybe someone might want to refer back to slides. I don't know. Perhaps.
Cool.
But yeah, we'll be taking questions, and you can raise your hand if you have a question. You can type it in the chat. If you do so, please put the word question : before it. And also, if you're in the YouTube live stream, we'll be looking there peeking in there from time to time to check on questions there. So you can also type in your questions on the YouTube live stream. So we already have a couple of questions in chat.
I think Aaron Adair had to leave early, but
yeah, would you please?
Yeah, he asked two things. One, did a chattel slave in Israel have the possibility of manumission? If they're marked on the ear, which is permanent, how could their slavery status end?
Yeah, that's a good question. So they didn't have the right to such manumission. So it would have been possible, but it would only have been by the will of the master, right? So once the Israelite debt slave underwent that ritual, that was it. He was a chattel slave. He had signed up for life. So the master could, in theory, set them free. Of course, we see from passages like Jeremiah 34 that it wasn't the norm. Certainly wasn't the norm to set your debt slaves free, even though the law required setting just a normal debt slave free. They didn't do that, so the likelihood that they would set free a permanent chattel slave is probably even less likely. But if Jeremiah 34 represents an historical account, so.
Were that to happen, how would that be indicated, especially if they're permanently marked on their ear after having become a permanent?
Yeah, this is sort of this would be something that would be problematic. And I guess I'd have to think about, generally speaking, in the ancient Near East, when a slave was manumitted, what happened to their mark? So if you think about the way that slaves were marked, for example, in Mesopotamia, it's often like a particular hairstyle. So you could, change that hairstyle. How that would work with the ear, that's a good question. Actually, I don't know the answer. So if the question is, once you've had your ear, if it's not a tag or something that goes through it, which is a possibility that the awl goes through so that a tag can be inserted, in that case, you could just take the tag out. But if it's some sort of, deforming of the ear to mark the slave very obviously to everyone that this is a chattel slave, so that if they run away or something, you can identify them. How that would be changed. Yeah, that's a good question. It's a good question. I don't know the answer.
And yeah, I think Aaron also had one more question, which was, did other nations such as Persia have less slavery or condemnation of the practice in antiquity, or is it too rare to have any good records?
I don't know that I could speak to Persia. I don't know that I could speak to Persia. Slavery, I'm gonna, I would go out on a limb and say, yeah, absolutely. They did, but without having done the specific research into Persian slavery, I wouldn't be able to speak to it. But certainly in the rest of the ancient Near East, if you get from the Neo-Babylonian period right on back, we see this in all the major law collections. And of course, in the actual legal cases that we see, slavery was very common. And the reality is that while passages, like Deuteronomy 15 and Leviticus 25, for Israelites in what I would argue are utopian style settings, advance, the humanitarian side of debt slavery, first by making it better, following their debt servitude, and then in Leviticus 25, theoretically doing away with it. Outside of that kind of development, slavery was pretty much on par in the Hebrew Bible and in the law collections there with what we see in the wider ancient Near East. So it really wasn't terribly different.
Makes sense. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense given how heavily it was influenced by everything around it, right?
Yeah.
Next, we have our last speaker, actually, Jim Majors, with a question. Jim, do you want to?
Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Dr. Josh. That was really informative. I really enjoyed that. I have a few questions, but for everybody else, I'm going to save the rest of them until everybody else is finished. I'll ask one right now, though. In 1 Corinthians 7, it outlines the Pauline ethics regarding sexual relations, and it says to avoid fornication or parneia, and it says it strictly defines appropriate sexual relations as being between a husband and his wife. So does that mean that slaves were given protection against being used for sexual purposes in early Christianity?
So probably the person to read on that would be Jennifer Glancy, also Ronald Charles. So the New Testament aspects of what I feel comfortable commenting on is probably rather limited, particularly to the things that I talked about. Certainly in the Hebrew Bible, sexual slavery is just the norm. So the idea of taking virgin women captive, as we see in places like Numbers 31 or in Deuteronomy 21. If you see among the captives a beautiful woman and you want to make her your wife, of course we would certainly consider those things not only sexual slavery but rape. But specifically about 1 Corinthians 7 and the practice of like Roman slave practices and how that was that was done in the New Testament church and early Christianity. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but again, Jennifer Glancy, excellent resource on that. And Ronald Charles has a new 2020 publication out on slavery and the silencing of slaves.
Gotcha.
In the New Testament, early Christianity. It's a good question.
If I remember correctly, Dr. Glancy actually says that it wasn't a protection against it.
Yeah, I would not expect it to be in any way. So if I had to, if you put a gun to my head and said, "Give me an answer," I would say no. Of course, the female slaves were not protected in that sense. But you know me.
Gotcha. I'll let everybody else ask their questions before I ask my other ones.
I haven't read all the secondary literature on it recently. I just won't say anything.
Shame on you.
Next we have a question from EZK3626, who's our friend from the subreddit, I think, Debate Christians. EZK, do you want to unmute or should I just read out your question?
So the question is just because I like your mission of increasing education on the topic. And so I'd ask, what are good resources that I, as a moderator, could give to a skeptic who wants to be more informed on the subject, obviously, other than your book that's upcoming? And then also, what would be good resources for Christians wanting to gain a basic understanding of the ancient Near East, since they're probably not going to be interested in your book?
Right. Yeah, that's so I have this book, which was the first one that I wrote, Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? This one, the whole purpose of the book is for me to be sort of a conduit of all biblical scholarship, consensus biblical scholarship, which, by the way, everything that I said is consensus biblical scholarship, to be able to say to a non-specialist, here's what they all say about this topic. So, it's got an extensive bibliography, and I quote both, conservative evangelical scholars and, liberal scholars. I quote them all. They all agree on this topic. And so, if that's probably a good place to start. But, there are lots of great resources on this. Hector Avalos, who just passed away a couple of weeks ago, which is a real loss. He has a book. Oh boy, now I can't remember the title of it. I think it's like a 2013 publication, but it's specifically on, slavery and biblical scholarship. But it's an excellent resource, goes through a lot of these things, hits different points than I do. I think I do that quite intentionally, but, he goes into the New Testament evidence as well. So that's a great book for the slavery discussion. As far as just the ancient Near East in general, I don't think I have it in here still, but Mark van der Meerop, and if people want to email me, Digital Hammurabi, digital HAMMURABI, Digital Hammurabi @gmail.com. I can get that, that link. I mean, that, I guess that link, that bibliographic citation. But he's got a wonderful history of the ancient Near East, which, gives all that broad historical background, but also gives some cultural background as well. Also, it's a little dated, but still excellent, is A. Leo Oppenheim's Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. I think it's mid-70s. But on our YouTube channel, Digital Hammurabi, I did a video series, whole playlist that sort of walks the non-specialist through Oppenheim's book. And it goes into all the different cultural aspects of the ancient Near East. It talks about history, about Omina, all the, the gods, what life was like, all those things. So those are really good resources. But again, people should feel free to email me to, to get those citations if they'd like them.
Thank you. And now we have a question from YouTube, from Richard Jones. Question: does there exist any evidence that, quote unquote, resetting the clock back to 0 or other value less than 7 years to extend service to a master? So I think essentially what they're trying to ask is, were there any circumstances where the 7-year clock would be reset?
Oh, I mean, not legally. If we're talking about the Hebrew Bible, and this sort of thing, we see, again, if we conclude that passages like Jeremiah 34 represent historical reality, which there's a good chance that it does. The freeing of even a Hebrew slave, an Israelite slave, was something that just was very commonly disregarded. And so the passage talks about how Israelites were supposed to be released, and they didn't after the 6 years. They kept them and kept them and kept them, and then finally, probably because of the siege they were undergoing, they set them free. Doing what God commanded, but then very quickly, probably after the siege, recaptured them all. Right. So could that be done legally? I don't think so. I don't think there's any legal provision that I know of to reset that clock. And I think this is probably again, this utopian sort of development. It very well may be in response to seeing how these things were not practiced and trying to make it even better for the Israelites, their own people. But this sort of, just very briefly, this sort of care for your citizenry more than foreigners is pretty common in the ancient Near East, and not just in practice, but also in the law collections, that sort of thing. We see that, I think, pretty regularly. So it's not unique to the Hebrew Bible.
Interesting. Thank you. And next we have a question from Rashida Buchanan. Rashida, do you want to ask yourself, or would you prefer for me to read it out?
Sure, I can read it out. So my question is, Exodus 21 verse 16 says that anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. How does this factor into your moral comparison of modern slavery versus slavery in the Old Testament, given that the entire premise of modern chattel slavery is the stealing of African bodies from their home countries?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So this is probably the one place that, and I'm no expert. Let's make sure everybody understands this. I'm no expert in American history. Like, this is definitely outside of my field. People should go read Thomas Morris's book. Oh, I forget every title of every book apparently, but it's like Slave Laws. I can't remember. Slave Laws in the South. Southern Slavery in the Law. That's what it is. Southern Slavery in the Law. But he goes into all the details on this. So as I understand it, eventually it was made illegal to kidnap people, right? That doesn't mean that they didn't do it. But it was made illegal, and as I understand it, in the South. But yes, this is definitely a distinction. That the commonality, I think, is more the rationale behind the laws that were made for how to engage with or how to treat your slave. Again, so that it's abundantly clear to everybody listening, because I want to be careful about this. Slave laws in both the South and in the Hebrew Bible were atrocious. Like the way that, slavery, whatever the laws were, slavery was atrocious. Any type of slavery is atrocious. So it's an atrocity. So this is why I think we need to bear this sort of thing in mind, that when I hear apologists defending Old Testament slavery, because, it wasn't so bad, it's actually a lot of commonality between the rationale in the Hebrew Bible and in the antebellum South. And we would be, it would just be horrific to go back down that path by trying to think about ways that slavery isn't so bad. No, slavery is horrible in every circumstance, in my opinion. But specifically with Exodus 21:16, this comes up a lot in that it's argued that there couldn't be any slavery in the Hebrew Bible because you can't steal people. And that's true. You can't steal people. It's illegal to steal people. It's illegal to steal people everywhere in the ancient Near East, right? You can't steal people. Which is odd for me to have to say, I think, but I do. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't slavery. There absolutely was slavery. The thing is, they didn't consider capturing people in war stealing. They didn't consider it immoral to purchase somebody else's daughter as a sex slave, right? They didn't consider that, as a concubine. They didn't consider that to be illegal. They didn't consider, something that was illegal or immoral. So yes, we got to be careful, as we do with anything, to make sure that we don't draw undue connections or just sort of woodenly say they're exactly the same, because they're definitely not. I would argue that there's very little exactly the same between even the ancient Near Eastern laws. There's definitely some, but we'd want to be specific about each case. But I do think it's important to draw the connections between the legal rationale that we see in the antebellum South and what we see in the Hebrew Bible to guard against doing it again, frankly.
I don't know if I can ask like a sub question, which is related to this one.
We do have quite a few other questions, so maybe in the time after the event, once the recording stops, we can continue, or you can enter the question queue.
Okay.
And we have a question from Michael. Michael, do you want to read that out, or would you prefer for us to?
Yeah, I can ask. I'm just wondering, like, you're talking about a lot of different ways of whether or not the Bible justifies slavery, but how did people in the South that were Christians and actually, held slaves or supported it, did they use biblical justification? Do you know about arguments that they might have had?
Yeah, I don't. That's certainly not something that I've spent any time on. I do know that arguments were made both in the North and the South utilizing the biblical text, which to me is unsurprising, right? Because I think one of the things that I think people misunderstand, and quite often apologists I think misunderstand, is that the Hebrew Bible isn't this unified voice and it is all saying the same thing. There are many different voices in the Hebrew Bible that are often conflicting with one another. So, and when you read it from a more modern perspective, and you don't take into account, what they would have heard, it's in historical context and its interpretive context. You read passages like Leviticus 19:33-34, which talk about, loving the foreigner, and you say, well, gosh, how can you love the foreigner and enslave them? How does that make any sense? How do those go together? There must not be, and some people conclude, well, there must not have been slavery. We must be just misunderstanding it. No, that's reading it from a very modern, modernistic, through a modern lens, because they didn't consider it to be oppressive, or immoral, to take a foreigner as a lifelong chattel slave. So, yeah, but I don't, as far as specifically what arguments are used, I wouldn't be the person to ask. There's a whole series of articles that were written in 19th century, but I can't remember particularly where they were. Maybe in Bibliotheca Sacra, but I'm not sure. Sorry.
All right,
Good
thanks.
question.
Thank you for answering that. And I actually probably need to head out, but Sohan, who is another member of our exec team, will take over the question moderation. Thank you so much, Dr. Joshua Bowen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, cool. We have a bunch of questions in queue. We have one question on YouTube from Bob Sabensticker. The question is, I've heard that Cynics or other Greek groups rejected slavery in contrast to the Bible not doing so. Is this correct?
Yeah, I don't know. Again, the New Testament's not the early first century, the first century and early Christianity is not really my field of study. Again, I would recommend reading Jennifer Glancy's book on slavery in early Christianity, or Slavery in the New Testament. Again, I can't remember the title specifically. But certainly, you'll see if you read through her work and again, the work of Ronald Charles or even Harrell, I think, you'll see that the early church wrestled with it far less than we would expect. And what they wrestled with was very different. And again, not an area of specialization for me, but they wrestled with things like how many slaves should you have? Because if you have, I think, more than two, it's considered gluttonous. It's not, you shouldn't have slaves because this is immoral. And this is part of the problem with this apologetic argument, that if the New Testament condemns slavery, if Jesus or Paul condemned slavery, then the early church didn't seem to know it or recognize it. So.
Thank you for answering that. We have a question. Jim has a hand raised. So Jim, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Okay, in Deuteronomy 23, 15 through 16, it talks about if a slave's taken refuge with you, that you're not to hand them over to their master. You're supposed to let them live among you and wherever they want, whatever town, and they shouldn't be oppressed. Some people cite this as evidence of an objection to slavery. Mm-hmm. Is that the case?
No, and this is universally. I talk about this in the book. This is universally brought up, I think, in every debate that I have on this topic. People say, well, hey, look, here, it says here, whatever you think about slavery, here in Deuteronomy 23, 15, 16, if the slave runs away, that's it. You can't hand them back over. So even if they did have slaves, if the master mistreated them, and they could just leave. So, the problem with the passage, it's almost universally understood by biblical and ancient Near Eastern scholars that this is talking about foreign slaves that are escaping, foreign slaves that are escaping from a foreign land around Israel into Israel. And if you read through the context of Deuteronomy, you'll see that one of the things that they're not supposed to do is have these sort of extradition treaties or any kind of treaties where you have obligations to the to the foreign nation. The only person that I know of, the only scholar that I know of now that I can think of that would argue, and he doesn't give any reasons why, he just sort of says it, is Richard Averbeck in a recent publication, I think it's 2019. It's in an edited volume. I can't remember for the life of me what it's called, but he's got an article on slavery. It's like the background or something, or behind the scenes of the Old Testament. But he wrote the article on slavery, and he's out at Trinity, and I love Richard. He's a great guy, but he's an evangelical scholar. And he just sort of has not a throwaway comment, but sort of any slave could go free if he, couldn't be returned if he ran away. But he's the only one that I can think of that makes a statement like that. Most, it's certainly the consensus. And the rationale behind it, without going into a great deal of detail, is what the passage is talking about itself. So, giving this verbiage of let him live wherever he likes, wherever he chooses. Well, if it were an Israelite, outside of being like a Levite, and even then, they would have a place to go, right? They'd be going back to their land. So, this one of the many reasons that scholars have determined this is talking about a foreign slave escaping to Israel.
So would one of these escaped slaves be like in Leviticus 19:34, where it mentions the stranger or the resident alien who lives among you being regarded as a native-born citizen? Would that apply to the escaped slave?
I think the escaped slave would just be a different context. Like a different category. And the reason is the passage actually seems to be very careful about what it says. It says it's basically a hands-off approach to the escaped slave. In other words, you don't take them in, you don't house them, you just sort of let them live wherever they want to go, wherever they want to live. You let them go there. And again, I think that the reasoning behind this is to sort of, it's all in this. What you're doing with these foreign nations that are around you, and not having these treaties, not being responsible for harboring a fugitive slave or an escaped slave. There's a lot to this, because the point is you can't then make them your slave. And I think there are lots of reasons too that I can think of behind that, but I think it's probably a different category. The escaped slave, I think you just hands off, you just let them be.
So if Deuteronomy 23:15 or 16 isn't an objection to slavery, can you think of anything that is an objection to slavery in the Bible? Yeah,
the only thing I think is Leviticus 25, and it's an important objection to it because what it shows is that by the time of Leviticus, the Holiness Code, which is arguably the latest of the law collections, by the time you get there, the attitude is now you can't treat Israelites as slaves. So I think what it says about it is that the Hebrew Bible is recognizing not that it's immoral. I don't think it's because it's an immoral thing in the sense of it being like slavery itself, any more than charging a fellow Israelite interest. It's not that charging interest is immoral. It's that doing it to your fellow Israelite is bad, right? That would be the only immoral, I think, comment on it. But it's wrong, or it's bad for Israelites to be taken as slaves. But that's not a statement against slavery. It's a statement against enslaving Israelites, which is very different and important. Oh yeah, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bowen. We have a few more questions in queue. By the way, everyone, we'll keep going for a bit and get this queue done, and then we'll have sort of an after party of sorts. We'll close the recording and the stream and just hang around. Whoever wants to hang around and discuss these, further, is welcome to hang around after. Okay, so Dr. Bowen, we have a question from EZK3626. What would you regard the likely date of the construction of the relevant texts? And how do you think the social context of this time and place influences the topic? For example, if written before exile or after exile?
Yeah, so it's the $64,000 question, right? When to place these things? I think again, the dating of the individual sources is certainly outside of my area of expertise. People, biblical scholars dedicate their entire careers to this sort of thing. So the place to start, just because I always like to do this, is Joel Baden's book, The Composition of the Pentateuch. And I would pick that up and read it if you're interested in that topic. It's an excellent discussion of the documentary hypothesis, but also gives you extensive bibliography. So that's where I would go. I tend to hold to, I think, what's sort of a common view, that the relative sequence would be, Exodus 21 in the Covenant Code is earliest. How early? I don't know. I would probably say, if I had to guess, like 8th century. But I mean, I don't. It's not my field. I mean, it's not my part of the field. I think I hold to the pretty common view that the Deuteronomist, Deuteronomy 15 would come next, maybe in the late 7th century. The Holiness Code, I don't know. I mean, that's the latest, again, relatively speaking, in my opinion. When that specifically dates to, I don't know, exilic, post-exilic, I'm not sure. Again, probably a good place to go would be Joel Baden's book. But the important thing, I think, for this discussion is the relative sequence. So the relative dating. So if the covenant code in Exodus 21 is giving sort of general laws that are being reworked in Deuteronomy 15, I think most people would agree to that. You could read Bruce Wells, who's written a lot on this down at University of Texas, Austin. And then those laws, both Deuteronomy 15 and maybe more specifically Exodus 21, are being reworked in the Holiness Code in Leviticus 25. So that's important, I think, to recognize for this discussion.
Thank you. All right, we have a question on YouTube from Ethan Steinberg. How is it, actually there are two separately, but it appears to be one question. How is Deuteronomy 23:15 compatible with the rest of the Bible's laws on slavery? If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Seems incompatible with slavery.
Yeah. And I mean, this goes back to the Jim's question. But the thing to remember about this is that Raymond Westbrook wrote pretty extensively on this. And he's one of many, but this isn't really something, I think Christian apologists maybe don't recognize that this is something that I would call this the consensus scholarship, the Deuteronomy 23:15-16 among biblical scholars and Near Eastern scholars is talking about this, an aspect of extradition. So don't have an extradition treaty with the nations around you. So again, the idea here is that you've got a foreign slave who's escaping, let's say from Moab or Edom. They're coming into Israel. What you're not supposed to do is have an extradition treaty with, Moab to say, all right, we'll give you your slave back because that's what our treaty says to do. You're not supposed to have that. And again, I talk about this in the book in more detail, and I cite the relevant sources for that. So if people are interested in that, but again, Richard Averbeck is the only person that I know of. Tikva Freimer-Kensky leaves it open a little bit, although I don't think she actually is leaving it open. But almost everybody else that I can, in fact, everybody else that I can think of would say, no, this is talking about a foreign slave. It's not any slave. It's a foreign slave coming from a foreign nation into Israel.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Rashida Buchanan again. Would you please unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thanks so much. So yes, my question is kind of going back to the moral comparisons between the modern era slavery. So I'll just read it out. You mentioned that the intention of Israelite law was to protect slaves versus modern chattel slavery where the intention was to financially profit from free labor. What are your thoughts on the moral intentions of the two slavery routes? Furthermore, Jeremiah 22 verse 13 says, "Woe unto him that buildeth his house by unrighteousness, and his chambers by wrong, that useth his neighbor's service without wages, and giveth him not for his work." Given this verse, how are the intentions of modern era chattel slavery more pronounced in wickedness as opposed to the intentions meant to be provided by the Old Testament law, regardless of whether or not the Israelites decided to follow it?
Okay. So I'm going to try to remember both of those. So the key to this, to my point, and this is where I think the waters get a little muddied, is comparing Old Testament laws to antebellum South practices. And you can't compare those, right? It's not a fair comparison. So what was done in the antebellum South was just horrific, right? It's just horrific. But if you read through what the legal rationale, and that's the point that I'm trying to make here, is that if you read through what the judges are wrestling with, what their tension is in their mind, it's that, look, it's wrong, it's unbecoming of a Christian man or a Christian person to abuse their slave. It's certainly unbecoming, or unheard of. I can't remember the verbiage that they use, but to certainly to murder their slave. And so that moral premise is there, right? That's what they're trying to say. The law, anyway, is trying to say you can't abuse, certainly you can't murder a slave, but the master has to be, in their mind, the master has to be able to physically, moderately correct their slave in order to get them to do things, right? Again, the whole thing's horrific, but in my opinion, but the law, the legal rationale appears to be the same when you look at places like Exodus 21. Exodus 21 is saying, well, yeah, I mean, you have to be able to beat your slave, right? That is the whole point of Proverbs 29. But be careful how you do it. And I think that's the same rationale that you see in the laws in the antebellum South, particularly post-revolutionary. And you mentioned Jeremiah 22. And again, we have to be careful that we don't conflate, right? It's always wrong to not pay someone when you're supposed to pay them. It's always wrong to kidnap someone when they're not yours, right? It's always wrong to do those things in their mind. What we can't do is conflate, slavery is not paying somebody, and you should be, because in their mind, a slave, you're not supposed to pay them, right? So they wouldn't have considered that in the same way. So that's the important thing. It's comparing laws in the antebellum South and laws in the Hebrew Bible. And I mean, I think you said it well, irrespective of how people followed them or not, right? There's no question. You can't, I don't think it's fair to turn to Jeremiah 34 to Nehemiah 5 or, and say, or to Amos or any of these passages and say, well, look what the people were doing in the Hebrew Bible. God's awful because of, look at how the people behave. Well, that's not fair, right? You can't look at how the people were. If you're taking that internal critique, you can't look at how the people acted and then say, well, God's bad. No, you have to say, well, what are God's commands? That's what you have to go by, I think, in that context. It's a good question. These are great questions.
Okay, I believe that's almost the last question. There was a question asked on YouTube, which I'm going to paste as well in the Zoom chat. And the question is, I think it's a general, what do you say to apologists who often say we shouldn't judge people of their time by our standards today as a defense of Christianity as a whole? I think probably with reference to slavery and other Old Testament things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair, right? And we have to be careful about the context in which we do this. So let me give you an example that is outside of slavery. If you read through Deuteronomy 21 and you see that, I guess it's part of slavery, but you see the war captives passage. We have the captive bride, and you see there that the Israelite is, if he sees among the captive women this beautiful woman and he wants to take her for a wife, here's the process, right? Well, if we look at that, from our perspective, can that woman consent? No, absolutely not. That's rape. Whatever you do, the woman is not consenting, right? But the question is, would they have considered that rape? Right? Would they? And so I think we have to be very, very careful to judge, using that term, to judge the actions of people in antiquity on their terms. In the same way, and I use this example in my book, in the same way, when I was growing up, it was nothing for kids my age and myself to be spanked, right, with like a switch or something, or a big wooden paddle or whatever. Now, most people that I know, that I interact with, would think about hitting their child with a big wooden paddle as like, ugh, why would we do corporal punishment, right? That's crazy. But I don't think it's fair to look back to like our grandparents and to say, well, they didn't love their kids because they did something that we consider immoral today. I don't think that's fair. I think that's judging them and judging their intent and their motives on our standards rather than on theirs. So I think we have to be careful about how we do that. And I think the same is true with people in the ancient world. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't ever look at their actions and say, ugh, as I think we have to be very, very intentional about that. And I think this is a case where we have to do that. Where if again, I hear apologists doing this all the time, well, slavery wasn't so bad in the Hebrew Bible. That's a very dangerous mindset to get into, because I will hear this come up a lot where people will say, well, how else would you keep a slave in check, right? You had to be able to beat him. Like, that makes me cringe. Like, just stop, right? Because if you're going to justify it on their terms, how they saw it, that's one thing. But I think that in the end, you have to be able to step back and say, and this is my point, should we be picking up the Hebrew Bible and saying, these are biblical values that we should follow biblical values? And I think the answer is no, right? I think the answer is no. And that we have to be honest about what the Bible is, setting forth as its values. And John Collins has a great book on this, 2019 publication, I think. So anyway.
All right. Thank you. And actually, I have one question, which will probably be very quick, and then we'll let Jim have the last one. My question is about Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 10 to 18, which talk about what to do when you march up to a city, and the 11 is about like the people shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. 12 if you refuse to make peace, etc., etc. When the city falls, kill the men, the women, children, livestock is plunder for you. Mm-hmm. So I presume like these are for the cities which are far from you. Yes. The ones that are close to you, of course, of course, as from their perspective, you just kill them, right? So I presume when 11 talks about all the people shall be subject to forced labor, and when 14 talks about women and children, etc., as plunder for you, are they talking about Eved, or talking about slaves? And would these be foreign slaves? Come under the category of foreign slaves?
So it's a little bit more nuanced. So in the first scenario where you have a foreign, like a city outside of the 7 nations, if they accept your offer of peace, right, they accept to become a vassal, then what they become is, the term is mas in the Hebrew, and it's like corvée labor, right? So if you have like King Solomon, when he had building projects, he would conscript, right? He would get corvée labor, people to come and build his stuff. These aren't people that are living in your house, going out into your field and, spending the night, and they do work for you in your house for free and they stay there all the time. That's not what this is. These are people that they live in their city. They're just subjected to corvée labor.
And what about
When,
flogging?
yeah. So then if that city puts up a fight, you emasculate the city, right? Kill all the males, all the men, and the women and children, and they become plunder. So yes, those are like the sort of they're plunder, right? Just like you see in Numbers 31, they're plunder. So a lot of these people would become slaves, maybe the majority. Again, is this how things were actually practiced? Like, does this represent historical reality? That's a whole nother topic, but I think that's what the passage is getting at.
All right. So we have the last question. I promised Jim the last question. So Jim, will you please unmute and ask?
Sure. Okay, so when you're comparing like Exodus 21 to Deuteronomy 15, for people who are familiar with the documentary hypothesis and everything, it seems that there's different laws for males and females. And my question basically is that in Exodus 21, it says that if a man sells his daughter, she's not to go free as the males do. But in Deuteronomy 15, it says that a male or female who sell themselves are to go free in the 7th year. So is the female in Deuteronomy 15 something other than a sex slave, as in Exodus 21? Yeah.
So this is sort of to put this into perspective, the two main positions on this, and I don't actually know where I come down on this because I think good arguments can be made on both sides. I tend to think that this is a reworking of Exodus 21 in this respect, but I don't think it has to be. So it's clear that in Exodus 21, we're talking about a daughter who's being sold by the father as a concubine, most likely, right, for sexual service. So then when you get to, so the text is very clear there, right? She does not go out, the Hebrew word there, yatzah, she does not go out as the male slaves do. And so there is no 6-year term of service. So when you get to Deuteronomy 15, I do tend to think that this is a reworking of that passage. And what it very well may be doing is doing away with this whole slave bride option for the Israelites. You can't take an Israelite as like a slave bride anymore. But it could also be that it's just not dealing with that it's not dealing with the slave bride issue. It's just trying to say, if you take a regular female debt slave, that she's then to be treated in the release sense, like any other male slave that's taken, female debt slave. But those are basically the two positions. It's a reworking, and it's saying, this is a total change, and the female slave is now incorporated. The other side is that no, this is just dealing with some different scenario for the female slave.
So what are you saying that if that a female slave wasn't necessarily, a female slave who didn't go in with her husband, who's a debt slave, being sold to pay off a debt or whatever, wasn't necessarily or didn't necessarily become a chattel slave due to their sexual relationship?
Right. I think this is the sort of thing that this is one of the problems, I think, in trying to wrestle with. This is one of the data points, because the rationale, I think, in Exodus 21 is that by using her for her sexual reproductive purposes, that you have to change her status, because what you've done is you've taken her value is depreciated in their eyes. So you have to change her status. You have to elevate her status. So that's what complicates this issue. And I don't know that I've thought about it from that perspective enough to have a firm position on it. It's a good question. Of course.
Right. So we're approaching 9 now, so we have to close the event. But thank you so much, Dr. Bowen. That was very comprehensive and enlightening talk on this subject, which I think not many people are acquainted with. I must say, like, if you remember the 10 Commandments, at the end, Moses says, go, proclaim liberty throughout all the land. Only later I found out that he's actually talking about the Jubilee, and not like, a general proclamation of ending all slavery everywhere. So yeah, it's something we find out later. And thank you for shedding light on this topic.
Of course.
Everyone,
Thank you
please,
for having me.
use your reactions, and thank you, Dr. Bowen. And I'll close the event now. So the recording, please hang around for the